Hello and welcome to Send Me. My name is Becky and 10 years ago I founded a missions organisation called One by One. Over the last decade I've seen God blow us away again and again and again of how He's stepped in when we've stepped out. Sometimes saying, "Here I am, send me," can come with its challenges, whether that's in the area of provision or different circumstances that hit our lives. And actually having a heart that's willing to persevere with the yes cry, even when life's challenging and difficult, is what really earns the rewards. I've watched God over the years pour in the most remarkable of ways. And so through this series with you, I'm hoping we can provoke a yes cry out of your heart so that you too will, just like the prophet Isaiah, say, "Here I am, send me." Well, this week I want to look at God's protection. There's been times where we've stepped out and all of a sudden, sometimes the nations we work in can be a little bit interesting. And occasionally we've stepped out and found ourselves in circumstances where we're like, "Okay, Jesus, you've got to do something here, because if not, we're in hot water." And again, God's come through. I remember one such time being out in Sierra Leone, and we'd done a gospel campaign in one city. And this particular day we'd stopped for lunch, and then that afternoon we were driving on to the next city where we were going to do another big gospel campaign. And so we're in a convoy of 3 cars, and the other 2 cars were ahead of us, and myself and my friend Amanda were in the last car. Well, it was in the day before mobile phones. I don't quite know how we lived before mobile phones, but I went through the first 2 decades of my life without one. And so I'm in this last car, we've just had lunch, we're driving on to the next city, when all of a sudden our car begins to chug, and then just totally stop in the middle of nowhere. Well, it was mid-afternoon, and so, to be honest, I wasn't really panicking all that much. Where we'd stopped was surrounded by trees, and it was actually quite beautiful. We'd been travelling for about an hour at this point, and so we got out of the car and were just happy to walk off the lunch we'd just eaten an hour ago, to be honest. Well, the other 2 cars carried on going ahead, not realising that we'd broke down, and without having a phone, we couldn't call them and let them know, so they'd totally gone on unaware of our situation. Well, we were strolling around and just exploring the area, taking it in, and because it was the middle of the afternoon, we weren't too bothered. Well, our driver had opened the bonnet of the car and looked in to see what was going wrong with the engine. So he stood looking in under the hood of the car, and he'd realised that there was one certain wire that went from the engine to another part of the car. Forgive me, I'm not at all mechanical, so I know nothing about cars, but it was this one wire that went from the engine to another part of the car, which was really serious, and it was that particular wire that had fried up and was no longer working. And so he'd said, well, I could walk back to the city because that's the only place I can find a garage that may even have a wire that we need. But in order to walk back, obviously it's an hour's drive away, so it's going to take me the rest of today to walk back there, by which point all the garages in the city have closed anyway. This means we're going to be here overnight. Well, as I say, I was okay, I was chilled out about it, until our driver, who's a local, started panicking. Once he started panicking, I started panicking. And he said to myself and Amanda, he said, "I think you need to get in the back of the car and duck down, because where we are is not a good area." And by now, mid-afternoon is now turning to dusk. Now in Africa, when it gets to dusk, once that sun's set, it is dark really quickly. And so he's panicking, so now we're panicking. We get in the back of the car and we're ducked down, and we're doing everything we know to do. So, Paul and Silas in jail, they sang songs. So we were singing all the whole hymns. We're praising God, every praise song we can possibly imagine and think of. We're trying everything. We've prayed all our powerful prayers and nothing seems to be happening. And we're moving nowhere. And we're in this dangerous area, stuck in the back of the car. This is not a great situation. And all of a sudden, this man on a bicycle appeared from behind our car and just pedalled towards us. And on the front of his bike, he'd got this little tiny basket. Well, he saw our driver with his head looking into the engine to see what was wrong, and so he pulled his bike up to the side of the road and he came across and asked what the problem was. Now, it just so happened that he happened to have in his tiny basket the exact wire that we needed for the engine. And he just so happened to know how to fit it. So he did. He came across with this wire and he fitted it from the engine to the other part. And then he got back on his bicycle and pedalled off into the darkness. Well, our driver got back in the car, turned the keys, and oh, that beautiful noise as the ignition started up, and we were able to drive off to the safety of that next city and meet up with the rest of the team. I remember in that moment thinking, either God had sent a Christian ahead of time with the exact car part that we needed, or that was an angel. And I don't know which it was, but what I do know is that in that moment, God protected us in the most incredible of ways. And I want to challenge you, as you begin to walk out in God's calling and God's purposes, it doesn't mean there's never going to be any problems. There'll be problems, all right. But it does mean that God's with you and he will protect you when you feel like you're in a situation beyond yourself. God will step in on your behalf. I want to read a scripture where God does this for someone in the Bible who's walking out in their calling and suddenly they face a challenge. So turn with me, if you have your Bibles, to Acts. I want to read Acts chapter 28, and I'm going to read from verse 1 down to verse 6. Now, it's Paul the Apostle, and at this moment in time, Paul's been preaching the gospel, and as a result of that, he's landed now in prison. He's now a prisoner, and he's on his way being transported to Rome. Well, while he's being transported in the ship, they run into a storm and he's shipwrecked. I mean, talk about life going bad. He's a prisoner after doing nothing wrong. He's a prisoner. He's now on a ship being transported to Rome and it suddenly hits a storm and he's shipwrecked. Let's pick it up from there. It says, now when they had escaped, they found themselves on the island of Malta. So this is where they've been shipwrecked to. And the natives showed unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and made us all welcome because of the rain that was falling and because of the cold. And when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened onto his hand. When the natives saw that the creature was hanging from his hand, they said to one another, no doubt this man must be a murderer, for although he escaped the sea, yet justice does not allow him to live. But Paul shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no ill effects. However, they were expecting that he would swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But after they had looked for a long time and saw no harm come to him, they changed their minds and said, he must be a god. You have to love how fickle crowds can be. 1 minute, the locals think he's a murderer or just someone really bad, and the next minute they think he's a god. The truth is that can happen in mine and your life too. Sometimes people think you're an absolute hero, they think you're incredible, and then the next minute something happens and you are zero. You've gone from hero to zero. You've gone from being this incredible person to suddenly they love you, then they hate you. If it happened to Christ, it can happen to you. If it can happen to Paul, it can happen to you. I think of Christ when he was coming in and suddenly they're laying down the palm branches and wanting to declare him as a king, and then the next week they're crying out, crucify him. The truth is, crowds can be very fickle. And if we base our identity upon what people say about us, then we'll be up 1 minute and down the next. 1 minute we're a hero, the next thing it's zero. And if we base our identity on that, we're going to be all over the place. The truth is, today your identity is based on who Christ says that you are. You are fearfully and wonderfully made, and God's plans are all over your life. I don't know if a label's been placed on you. Maybe you've been labelled a murderer. Maybe you've been told by the masses that you're not good enough. But let me tell you today, while ever you are walking in God's grace and forgiveness, you are called of the Most High God, and his plans and purposes will unfold in your life. Does it mean you'll never have challenges? Absolutely not. Just as Paul was facing being shipwrecked and now bitten by a snake, talk about a bad day gone wrong. In the same way, you and I will face circumstances, but God's provision and protection goes before us. A few years ago, myself and my husband had been out in Kenya, We'd done a missions trip in September 2014 and it was incredible. Our missions trips are always so much fun. They're very varied. We do everything from going into prisons out there to going and praying for the sick in the medical centre, to doing village evangelism from mud hut to mud hut, to then obviously being with our gorgeous babies in the King's Children's Home. The trips are always jam-packed and so much fun. Hard work, but fun. And so we'd been out in Kenya with a team, and I remember actually noticing I'd not seen many mosquitoes on that trip. Well, we came home from Kenya and literally dropped off the bags, picked up the clean washing and headed straight out to America, where we were doing a fundraising tour as we were just building our secondary school out in Kenya at that point. We were out in America for a few days when all of a sudden my husband Matthew became ill. At first, it just looked like a cough or the flu of some sort, and so we didn't think much of it. But as time started passing by, it began becoming increasingly worse. Well, on the 2nd of October 2014, I remember taking Matthew to the hospital, and I dropped him off at the ER and went to park up my car. When I walked back in, all of a sudden Matt was in a wheelchair. He'd apparently collapsed as soon as he'd walked through the door. He's surrounded by all these doctors who are saying, "You've not just been to Africa, have you?" You see, at this moment in time, it was just the year of the Ebola outbreak and everyone was talking about Ebola. And some of the symptoms that Matt had were indicative of it being Ebola. Well, they whisked him off into isolation and quarantine and began wearing all the spacesuits to come in and start taking the swabs on Matt. Well, I remember they finally found out it wasn't Ebola, thank you Jesus, but it was malaria. Now, by comparison of Ebola, I was thankful. I was breathing a sigh of relief that this is just malaria. You see, my kids get malaria all the time out in Kenya, and after a few days on medicines, they're fine, they're running around again. And so I remember saying to Matt, "Oh, you'll be fine, a couple of days on IV anti-malarial medications and you'll be good to go." Well, sadly, our story didn't quite go that way. 2 days later, Matt is becoming increasingly worse. I remember the part of diagnosis, the doctors told me already at that point, Matt's life was hanging in the balance. You see, severe malaria is if you have 5% of the parasite in your red blood cells. And on the day of Matt being diagnosed, he was at 20%. By this point already, his heart, his liver and his lungs and his kidneys were all in organ failure. Well, by the 4th of October 2014, it had gone from bad to worse. And I was taken into a side room and the doctor told me, "Mrs. Murray, we've just done another set of pathology results on Matthew's blood and it's now risen to 50% of his blood being filled with the malaria parasite." Well, I'm a nurse by background, and medically speaking, if your blood cells are half overtaken by a parasite, then by this point it's so rapidly multiplying that naturally speaking, there's no coming back from that. The doctors knew that. So she said to me, "We've actually stopped the treatment. We stopped the malaria treatment a few hours ago, and we're now just giving him pain relief until he passes." She began to tell me how they suspected Matt had maybe 2, maybe 3 hours left to live. I remember in this moment, it just felt like every dream and every promise was shattered on the ground. I remember thinking, this can't be, not my Matthew, not my husband, this cannot be. See, Matt was 27 at the time and he was fit and healthy and strong and well, not my husband. And every dream and every promise was suddenly shattered. I was determined. I didn't want to go into Matt's room and be hysterical. I wanted to compose myself as best as I could in a situation like that. I was hugging this trash can, I was hugging this bin and just retching into the bin. I was so full of shock, just couldn't believe what I'd just been told. I was trembling and shaking and just crying and sobbing into this bin as I'm holding it and just hugging it. And I didn't know what to do in order to tell everyone back home. You see, I needed to tell all Matt's family. I had to tell all my family. I had to tell all our close friends. I wanted people to be praying for him. And so the quickest way of telling all these people in our life was to pick up my phone and just put something out on social media. So I did. I picked my phone up and just typed into social media, "Urgent, please pray for Matthew." I put my phone down and it took me a good while to really get a grip as best as I could in that situation. As I say, I wanted his last few minutes on this earth to be peaceful and beautiful. I didn't want to be hysterical in his room. And so I put my phone down and began to console myself and then try and get as strong as I could so that I could be with Matt. I walked out of the room, and all of a sudden a nurse, as I walked past the nurse's station, she gave me this huge smile and she beckoned me over. And she said, "Mrs. Murray, I have no idea what's happened because we stopped all the treatments hours ago. But in this last hour, we've just took another set of pathology results back, and Matt's blood levels, the malaria's dropped from 50% down to 10%, and we have no idea how." In that moment, I remember saying, I know how, as I knew God had done a miracle. It was still a process from that point on of organ after organ beginning to turn around. But I remember knowing in that moment that God had done a phenomenal and powerful miracle. Matt now is healthy and strong and well, and I'm delighted to say he's as strong as ever. But in that moment when medicine failed, God came through in the most remarkable of ways. I remember a nurse on the ICU actually giving her heart to Christ because she'd seen firsthand, medicine didn't do this, God did this. And so she gave her heart to Christ. I have a plaque on my living room wall that says, "The will of God will never take you where the grace of God will not protect you." And we saw that unfold with Matthew, where God's grace came through and protected us in a very beautiful way as he brought Matt through in an impossible situation. I think sometimes we can believe God for the big things, but actually it's the small things where we struggle to find the faith for. But I want to encourage you today, God's in the detail of our lives. I remember whilst we were going through this very interesting situation where my husband is dying, having this moment of a breakdown in the car where I'm driving to the hospital and I suddenly realised I don't have any money for fuel and my gas light has been flashing since the day before. It suddenly dawned on me, if I make it to the hospital, I don't even know if I can get back home again. And I don't have any money to buy even a glass of water today. What am I going to do? And it was so insignificant by comparison of my husband's dying, but it was the straw that broke the camel's back for me. And I'm sat at this red traffic light and I just had this total meltdown at God. I am absolutely sobbing my heart out. I remember this guy pulling up at the side of me and just staring at me. He's probably thinking, is she on the edge of a nervous breakdown? I couldn't wait for the traffic light to change. It finally changed and I was able to go after I had my absolute mess of a breakdown. And I arrived at the hospital. And as I walked on, I remember walking into the ICU area. And before going in to see Matthew, I always had to go and stop at this certain desk and get permission to go in. I think they do it in case you walk in at a moment where they're resuscitating or something dramatic. And so I came up to this area and I said, okay, I'm here to see Matthew Murray. And all of a sudden, while the nurse is ringing through to see if I can go in, a complete stranger walked up to me and she said, I have no idea why, but I feel I need to give you this. And she put $50 in my hand. Well, those $50, it cost me $40 to fill the tank with gas, and it left me with $10 to buy some water and a coffee that day. But as she put the $50 in my hand, I just felt the whisper of heaven say, I've got this. And the truth is, if God is capable to see my gas tank needs filling, then he's more than capable than to see my big need of my husband needs resurrecting. I want to encourage you, maybe your issue today is not some huge dramatic need and you're almost thinking, well, it's almost too small to bring to God. Let me encourage you to bring it to God today, because just as he sees the big stuff, so he sees the little stuff. He's invested in the detail in your life and wants to bring you through and protect you even in the small areas too. Well, that little moment of the $50 gave me the faith that if he can fill my tank with gas, he's more than capable of healing my husband, and sure enough, he did. In that moment with Matthew, medicine wasn't able to come through. That being said, I am so thankful for the nursing staff. I watched those doctors and nurses work so hard on Matt in his most darkest hours. I'm a nurse by background, so maybe I'm biased, but I cannot say how thankful I am for the NHS. To see our health system come through, I'm so thankful. A few years ago, I actually lost one of my own little kids to malaria. Titus was only 9. He'd got dreams of going on and being a teacher, and he was a beautiful boy. I can always see him with this little red car running around. And he lost his battle to malaria. And so we've decided in Titus's memory, we're actually going to build a medical centre out in Kenya. We've seen firsthand the difference that just helping people with practical medical help can make. A few years ago, we did a medical mission and the whole town came out for it. We started our clinics at 8 a.m. in the morning, but by 6 a.m. in the morning, there was already a huge line of people waiting to come in to see the doctors and the nurses. Through that time while they were waiting, we were able to preach the gospel. Years later, our village is still talking about the time where we brought free healthcare to their village. It was an incredible impact and such a practical way to reach our village with the love of Jesus Christ. Well, I want to show you a little video clip now of that fun medical mission. So why don't you watch this with me?
We're going to remove a tooth. He's got what we call a supernumerary tooth, an extra tooth. That's giving him some pain in his mouth, so we're going to remove that supernumerary tooth.
It's not a coincidence that in the scriptures poverty is mentioned more than 2,100 times. It's not an accident. It's a lot of airtime. As you have done it unto the least of these my brethren, you have done it unto me. God may well be with us in our mansions on the hill. I hope so. But the one thing we can all agree, all faiths, all ideologies, is that God is with the vulnerable and the poor. God is in the slums, in the cardboard boxes where the poor play house. God is in the silence of a mother who has infected her child with a virus that will end both their lives. God is in the cries heard under the rubble of war. God is in the debris of wasted opportunity and lives. And God is with us if we are with them. Stop asking God to bless what you are doing. Get involved in what God is doing, because it's already blessed.
That medical mission was so impactful on our village as people years on are talking about what difference that made to their lives. I've been out there as I've watched 9-month pregnant ladies in labour walk for miles to get to a medical centre, only for it to be closed and they have to turn away and give birth in a mud hut. And after both Titus and seeing the needs medically in our village, we decided to build a medical centre. We know that God's going to pour through that place in a very practical way. The medical centre will be predominantly for our own kids, but when the government clinic in the village is on shut down, we can also help people in our village and very practically reach out and help them. Let me encourage you, maybe you're sat there thinking about doing a missions trip. Why not check out the website onebyone.net and have a look at trips that we're going to be doing in the future. Maybe we need what you've got, whether you're a doctor or a nurse or a teacher, or maybe you're sat there thinking, I don't know what I can offer. If you can hug a kid, I'll take you. We take people all around the world with us on missions trips, and it's been so exciting over the years to watch people be so impacted. Something happens when you step out of your own comfort zone and begin to love other people. Something happens in your life where you're suddenly transformed. I remember a few years ago, we took a volunteer out called Sally from Texas, and she was so moved after spending a week at our children's home that she went back to Longview, Texas, and began working in foster care, helping kids in her own area after she'd stepped out of her comfort zone and gone across the world. You see, we need all hands on deck. We need everyone to cry out, here I am, send me. Maybe today we need you. Check out the website and see how you can get involved. Maybe you can sponsor one of our kids. Maybe you can help one of our kids receive medical care so that they don't end up like Titus did. If you're able to help us, please check out the website and have a look. Also, if you were moved by the story that I shared with my husband Matthew, you can pick up a copy of Embrace the Journey on the website. I talk about it in much more detail of the horrors we went through in the seasons, but also the miracles that God did during that season with Matt recovering from malaria. So make sure you pick up a copy from the website and you can read all about it. Well, I want to encourage you today. Maybe you stepped out in the call of God and you're thinking, okay, I've found myself in situations, maybe it was like me where I was stranded in the outbacks of Africa and I needed that man on a bicycle. Or maybe it's a situation of a health diagnosis like what Matthew had. And you've stepped out in the call of God and all of a sudden circumstances have hit your life. Let me encourage you, just as Paul was still a prisoner and Paul was still shipwrecked, yet had the hand of God upon him, let me encourage you that even in your challenging seasons, God's hand is very much upon your life. Don't think like God's stepped back from you, God's removed from you. He's very much with you. We shared a few weeks ago about being in the pits and being in the prison when Joseph thought he should be in a palace. Yet God was with him in the pit as much as he was with him in the palace. And God can turn any situation around, whether it's a diagnosis that you've received or whether it's a challenging situation. God can turn that situation around for his glory. When you're walking out in his plans and his purposes, I promise you, his protection goes before you. He makes the path ahead of you straight, and he will continue to do that. I want to encourage you to go for it. Just like Isaiah the prophet said, "Here I am, send me." Despite whatever your circumstances are, whatever you're crying, yes, Lord, I promise you, he will make the path straight ahead of you. He will protect you and guide you and plan your steps. I want to bless you this week. I hope you'll join me again next week when I'll be looking at perseverance. Perseverance is a real character trait that every single one of us who cry, "Here I am, send me," need to have. So I hope you'll tune in and join me again next week. God bless.